Got a bit of a project on my hands today. This is the HT SPEC Civic X, which was wrecked the day that we bought it, but it's got a completely fresh 44-mile on it powertrain. It's a 1.5 liter turbocharged engine with a manual transmission. They make like 170 odd horsepower stock, but people have been tuning these things up well over 250 up to 300 foot-pounds. You know, I've got to get in there and play with it. You know, I bought this car to mess around and see what the powertrain was going to be like on the inside, and haven't had a chance to do that yet. So today I'm going to drop the transmission out, maybe somewhat of a little DIY on that too, just because I know that clutches are one of the big things that are going out on these cars, especially with all the torque that's available. And rather than pay for a clutch job, you might want to do it yourself. So I'm going to show you how I do it. Alright, well I printed out some instructions from the Honda service website. It looks like number 1 is to lift the vehicle, number 2 is remove the front grille cover, 3 air cleaner, battery remove, and remove the base, and air intake ducting. Some of you probably have an aftermarket intake and probably have that removed. These are all really pretty basic items. The front grille cover is just held on with some of these, what I like to call bitch clips. You just kind of wiggle those off with a screwdriver and they come right off. And then the intake is pretty easy. You know, you got a screw here and then some screws around here. So getting that out and the battery out, it's fairly basic. And I think actually somewhere in the instructions it's going to say to take this computer out as well, just a couple of bolts. So step 1 is get the car off the ground and remove some of that stuff. Intake, the top part, battery, the computer, and that front grille cover. I am using a lift here. I understand that most of you probably are not. Sucks to be you, I guess, but it's still a totally doable job on the ground. All right, finishing up the top part of the accessory removal here. Intake is off, battery's out, computer's out, associated brackets are out. Now I'm down on the battery base, and I wanted to give you 2 tips. Tip number 1 is when you remove nuts and bolts, put them back loosely where they came from. That way they won't get misplaced. You know exactly which bolt goes where. There's less likelihood that you'll have bolts left over in the end. The next one is these battery trays are always held in by like a lot of hardware. There's 3 bolts on the top that you're going to do, and 2 down below, 1 here and 1 just under there. And in order to remove those, I use a swivel socket. That's a 12mm socket, but it's got that swivelly head on it. That makes that job really easy to get those ones down below. They're not too hard to get to. But the other thing is that you don't have to remove these bolts all the way. The bracket is slotted on the bottom, so when you just loosen those, you know, I have to fight with some of the harness stuff, but yeah, the bracket has some slots in the bottom, so you don't have to worry about taking those all the way out. You probably want to thread those out a little bit more to make the bracket going back in a little bit easier. Back at the manual, now we're going to do slave cylinder, remove. We're just going to move it out of the way. We're not going to completely disconnect the hydraulics here. Intake, air duct, remove, wire harness on the transmission. Slave cylinder is right under there. 2 bolts on top, undo that bracket, swing it out of the way. I believe this is probably the intake duct they're talking about, and the harness for the engine, the bracketry for the transmission side engine harness is going to be underneath there. So we'll clear that out next. Alrighty, the next step in here, more wire harnesses now on the engine side. So this picture is looking a little convoluted. Pulling all this apart, what you're going to do is, first of all, don't forget about this little guy back here. There's like M6 bolt over here that you're going to take out. Remove this plug off of the transmission and get that out of the way. And then it wants you to come over here. You're going to undo these 2 grounding terminals here. It wants you to open up this cover, remove some brackets and such. Basically, you're just going to have to do some general disassembly here. This stuff kind of clips together. Open this up, remove a couple of brackets here. This bracket that holds these hoses is going to come off, and just sort of generally move this stuff out of the way. When you're done, you should kind of plainly see where the transmission is, and with nothing really obstructing it, and just kind of give a general look over here to make sure that there's nothing bridging between the engine and the transmission that's going to be a problem when the transmission comes off. Okay, so dealing with all this harness baloney here, I found that I probably don't need to take apart as much as they said. I took apart I took off these 2 grounding bolts here. The harness then connects with all this spider of thing. It sort of routes underneath these 2 coolant hoses and bolts down with this bolt, and then connects to these plugs down here. So I undid those and got this little spidery thingy out of the way. pretty clear shot to the bell housing there. Underneath this thermostat housing, it's pretty clear. Looking over here, there's really nothing in the way. There is a harness here that I had to unplug and move out of the way, and the bracket is still on. I'm just gonna leave it on for now. I got that other harness that was back behind here connected to that plug. And actually, I'm looking pretty free. I don't see why I would need to move anything else, even these brackets. Maybe to give a little more room. Maybe I'll end up doing that afterwards. I'm sure taking that off is gonna help with removing some of this other stuff, but I'm just gonna leave it for now. And now it's time to disconnect the shifter assembly, which is gonna be pulling these cotter pins out and a series of bolts holding this bracket on. Looks like one here, probably another one hiding, probably right there underneath. Yeah, it looks like one going straight up and down and two going in laterally. We'll pop those guys off. Do not wipe the grease off of the change wire ends, okay? And then intake manifold bracket it wants, engine support hanger. We'll get there in a second. Now the shifter assembly's coming out. Got the shifter assembly successfully unbolted. It was really rather easy, just 3 little bolts. You kind of have to feel around to find the last one, but it kind of goes into this hole. And here's another little tip that I had. Bungee cords are your friends. You know, you could tie this up any kind of way, but I got this bungee cord just sort of gently holding this shifter assembly out of the way, and I got it hooked onto the brake line. You know, I've got the positive battery cable kind of pulled up over here. I've got this engine harness sort of being held up and out of the way as it's wedged in between the negative battery terminal that's being bent that way, and then I've got the slave cylinder tucked all the way up into here. I got ground wire disconnected from the transmission, and that's sort of tucked in here holding all that up. I like to really get everything out of the way, because now I got space to work. Even if I'm jostling with this, it's not going to come flying back out at me. And I think that that's one of the most important parts of dealing with all these hoses and wires and things, is to get them out of the way so that they're not causing you headaches when you deal with that monster in a minute. It looks like they want us to now suspend the engine. So I'm gonna pull out my engine tool. I do not have this special Honda arrangement. I will go over hooking that up in just a moment. The next step in the instructions said to remove the intake manifold bracket. I did not see how or where any intake manifold bracket was going to be an issue. So I'm moving on to the next step, which is to rig up this engine support brace. Now this one doesn't look exactly like the one that they have in the Honda manual. It is similar to the one that used to be provided for previous generation cars. I think this is going to work just fine. You're going to have to like attach the engine to this, and that way when you take out these transmission mounts and loosen whatever engine mounts are required, the engine doesn't fall out of the car, and then you can drop the subframe out from below, and that's how you get the transmission out. People will talk about you don't need to drop the subframe out. I'm going to get underneath and look and make sure, but honestly, these cars are not designed the way that earlier Hondas were. You can't just hang them off of the engine mounts. You're probably going to break something. So I would recommend getting one of these. It's a pretty cheap investment. You know, it allows you to get this job done on your own. So the trick is getting this so that it's not going to move. The frame rail here is sloped a little bit, so I've got this foot sort of up against the prop rod bracket, and I've got it adjusted to sort of an appropriate length to fit here. Don't worry about breaking this too much. I don't think that's going to be an issue. It's sitting forward a little anyway, because to get this stabilization beam put in place, I had to angle it just a little. And I've got this right now resting just on this core support. I'm not really wild about how slippy this is. I probably would rather put it in a more captive spot like this, but the problem there is then it's at a weird angle. We're gonna need to support the engine, so remember the load is gonna be over here. Really the trick is getting this put in a final position where you can suspend the engine safely. It's not gonna be holding a ton of weight. You just don't really want it shifting on you. The other thing is there's a series of like hooks and things that you can use, and a chain and a cable. There's like an eyelet that you can mount on here somewhere. That's what the factory says to do. To be honest, most of the time what I do is I just run a tie strap underneath like this thermostat housing or any other sturdy thing on the engine and just kind of ratchet it up. I am going to fiddle with this a little bit and show you what my final setup looks like. Okay, so here's my first stab at suspending this. I have this set up where I feel like this isn't going to move around, and there's a reasonable angle here. If you think about where the load is, you know, the engine's going to be hanging like this, so you want the most support probably right at the end. So underneath here, I've got this tie strap right underneath this heavy coolant aluminum deal here. But this strap is going underneath these. It's going to start tightening up, and I really don't want to pull on these too much. As I pull on this ratchet strap, you can see transmission mount wiggling just a little bit as I tug on this. That means it's taking the load off of the mount there, and I should be able to tug that up just a tad, loosen these brackets. So that's what I'm going to do next. And this is why it's helpful to have factory instructions, because it says to remove this mount bracket, first we're going to remove the ground cable, which we've already done, and then we're going to remove the transmission mount B, right, which is the mount that you see there, and we're going to remove this bolt, this bolt, this bolt, anything with an X, all these bolts. But it says, note, for manual transmission, do not remove the bolt C from the transmission mount. If the bolt is removed, the transmission mount must be replaced as an assembly. So it sounds like taking that out might totally screw us up. You know, it might be kind of tempting at some point to just reach in there and pull that bolt off of there, but you see, like, completely covered in paint. Do not take off. Okay, fine. We'll just take off this, that, and that. And so to get into there, you're probably going to want sort of a longish extension, and those look like 17mm fasteners. So that's coming out next. So I'm working on fasteners that are buried deep in the engine bay like this. Sometimes they'll be worse. I like to use a really long extension and get away from the work, as so it was told to me when I was first starting out. And I've got this long, it's not a breaker bar because it's a ratchet, but I use it like a breaker bar. These fasteners are not super tight, but you can get a lot of leverage with a long handle like this. The extension is going to take some torque away. So it might be tempting to use, you know, like an impact wrench, which I highly recommend getting one of these. But the thing is you're going to lose some torque through this extension. So I like to loosen everything by hand and then come back with this to zip everything off. So I went to go take this bolt out and was really unthrilled to see that this wire harness thingy was in the way. And getting it off, it's like attached to the frame rail. And you see this little arrow here points underneath that there's actually a clip that you can push the screwdriver in and release it. It just slides straight out like this. So that's how you're gonna get some room on that last bolt. So I've got all these fasteners loose here. Basically, I left a couple of them just sort of like a couple of threads in because I wanted to make sure that when I loosen this last one, which I'm going to do sort of slowly, that everything drops down to the way it's supposed to. See, that last one's going to have some tension on it. That means that probably I could stand to tug on the engine just a little bit more, because I don't want the whole thing falling down as I take out this last nut. See, it's dropping down. All right, now I'm putting a lot of force on this bracket here to get it to hold the engine up. As I put load on this thing, you know, everything's sort of moving. I just got to really double check and make sure that I've got a good firm hold on all this stuff so that when this is completely out, I'm not going to have a problem with support. Looks like this strap has got some slack in it still. It's not really sliding underneath this very well. I'm feeling to see if there's any like sharp edges or something that might be causing me a problem. Right now it feels sort of like everything's all right. So I'm gonna basically continue on here. I'm gonna need to use both hands, but I'm gonna put a little more tension on this to try to make it so that that nut doesn't have any real pressure on it as I'm undoing it. Well, I had a bit of a failure, and here you can see coolant. And what has happened is it looks like probably I'm tugging on that fitting a little too much. Maybe I would have been better off with the other ones, maybe not. Anyway, this routing is not a good idea. So scratch that. I've tightened up a bunch of these bolts on the bracket to get it all held back in place again. And I will find a new way to suspend the engine that isn't gonna be as risky. Reattempted here, and it looks like I've got a little more stability. I am just holding on to the thermostat housing right now with the strap fed through the hook here. So I've got some tension on there, and I've used this auxiliary hook that came with my anchoring tool to give a little extra support underneath the core support there, and you can see now like a lot more ability to hold this in place. I think the only real risk here is I've got this lateral loading on the engine, so depending on where the center of gravity of this engine is, after we take the bracket out, the whole thing might shift or move. So again, we're gonna come in here and loosen these guys up sort of gently so that they don't all come flying apart, and then we'll see if this comes off easy or not. Yeah, see, it's wanting to sink anyway. But see, I can really pick it back up a lot more easily with this ratcheting setup. See? The last bolt is coming out smooth and easy. That means I'm not having any load on that last fastener. And so what I would really hope is that I could spin all these by hand. And that means I'm being suspended really well. This one's got a little torque on it, but it's not too bad. And then I've got this one still hanging out. So I'm gonna pull the rest of these guys out, and then the bracket should basically come free. I'm gonna do this last one live so we can see what happens. Yeah. Whoops. Well, besides dropping my huge extension, no drama. So I think this is going to be the ticket. We got the left side engine mount and bracketry assembly out of the car now. So everything is free here. As you can see, we can kind of like wiggle this around, and we're pretty well supported here by our contraption. I don't know, yours was probably going to look different. Hopefully, maybe it looks a little different. With that, we go back to our procedure here. Upper transmission mount mold remove. Transmission mount remove. Next is steering joint disconnect. So the car is low, and these procedures are designed for technicians who are using a lift. And so the idea is you have the car down, you do all this top stuff first, then lift it up, and then do all the underneath stuff. If you're working on the ground, you may or may not be doing the steering thingy next, but this is the next part of the procedure. Now I printed those out separately, and here we go. So you're going to disconnect the steering column from the steering rack, and it's just one pinch bolt that goes through here. You get underneath the dash, remove this plastic cover, and then undo the bolt that comes out of here. This is sort of a springy telescoping thing, so that's why they have it tied up here like this. But they have you lock the steering wheel in place, and the reason why they have you do that is because, you know, that way you won't lose your orientation of the wheel when you put it all back together. Sometimes I like to put a paint mark down here too. That sometimes helps because I don't have one of these steering wheel locking thingies, so that when you put it back together, it's in exactly the right position. You can pause the video here if you want to read these instructions, but other than that, I'm just going to do it. Alright, I've got the steering shaft disconnected inside the car. I'm suspended here, and I'm about to raise the car up. Now, if you have a lift, good for you. If not, I'm sorry. But one thing to do before you start working underneath the car is I just did a quick little look around. Make sure that I don't have any tools here. Once the car's up in the air, you'll be missing a tool and not be very happy. Also, you know, just give a final check and make sure it's suspended pretty well. You know, I'm gonna get underneath the car with all this stuff. I feel pretty confident with how this is set up here. So up goes the car, and this is the magical part. Well, the next step here is going to be to stop about midway up and pull these wheels off. So I'm pretty sure you all know how to do that. Once I get the wheels off, lift vehicle up magically, front wheels removed, engine undercovers removed, engine undercover lid. That's all stuff you guys know how to do. Drain the transmission fluid. I don't think there's going to be any trick there. Front floor brace. Now that has some interesting notes on it. So we'll pick up then after I do these steps 21 through 24. Wow, that is my transmission fluid. I don't think anybody here is going to have as clean and clear a transmission fluid as that. That is transmission fluid with 44 miles on it. Oh my god, I can't believe this car got wrecked. Eyeballs are important to continuing to finish this job. I've had little pieces of dirt and metal and stuff fall in my eye. I'm not planning on having any issues with this because this car is basically brand new, but your car has got a lot of grime and stuff, and honestly, getting some crud in your eye in a really compromised situation is just not a good idea. It's just never a good policy. So please stop the video, go put some safety glasses on. Okay, next is this front frame brace thing, which it has some funky instructions on how to take this out, and where you take the outer bolts out first, and then these bolts have this funky arrangement here with another spacer. Like, I guess this is supposed to be tightened more or less up against the plastic brace there. I don't know, for some reason mine is not like that. I can't remember if I took this out or not, but you know what? These bolts just come out just like normal, so zip those bad boys out next. And moving on to the next step is going to be exhaust pipe, EPS, sub-harness disconnect. That's disconnect the power steering deal. That's pretty easy to get to. It's just right, wait, I lost it. Oh, back behind underneath this brace here. You're going to unplug this bad boy right there. Mine's already unplugged because I've been testing with this car. And then it wants to undo tie rods and lower ball joints. And then after that, I think the axles pop out. Okay, with the lower ball joints disconnected and the tie rods disconnected, now they want us to undo these stabilizer links. The next thing it wants us to do is take out the A pipe here. Some people will call it the front pipe or the down pipe, but it's not. This is called the A pipe. It's 3 bolts here, a couple there. I think a lot of people already sort of know how to take those out, as well as this dog bone, which is the next thing. Yeah, we're resonator chamber again. That's going to come out. Lower arm mounting bolt. These are going to come out right here. Lower mounting bolts, end links, tie rods, ball joints, mount, exhaust, and then we're getting really close. Well, something really interesting just happened. I loosened the last bolt on the exhaust system, and I had this engine mount out, and this whole thing just swung forward. Up here, my gantry is still holding, but now I do have this offset load on the powertrain, so that's going to make it a little odd to come out. Doesn't appear to be really pushing on anything too gnarly here. It's resting a little bit on this charge pipe, or whatever that is, coolant hose. I don't feel too terribly about this whole situation, except for the fact that I really wasn't expecting it. And the reason why is because this is still attached to the chassis. Subframe, there's a hanger here, and the whole exhaust system is attached to the car, but this part is of course attached to the engine. So by loosening it up, just unloaded a lot of stuff. It was a little startling, but just keep that in mind, that how you mount things up there makes a pretty big difference throughout this job. Now it's time to pull out the subframe. Got to think about where I'm going to put that. So I actually have this heavy duty cart here, which I use to put the subframe on. I loosen it a little bit and I lower the car down so the subframe is taking some load here, and then I finish loosening all the hardware, lift up the car, and the subframe stays behind. It usually works out really pretty well. This subframe is shaped a little strange though. It's kind of like got these 2 arms that fly forward, and then of course this big bulk in the middle here, and then these 2 shorter arms in the back. So I'm gonna guess that most of the weight is just sort of right in the middle here. And so I've positioned my deck just right about here. If you're on the ground, I guess you're probably gonna use a floor jack and then maybe some 2x6 or something like that. The trick is gonna be finding where the weight is gonna be centered. The steering rack comes with this whole mess, and it looks like probably the sway bar too. A bunch of stuff is going to come out along with the subframes. It talks about installing an alignment pin, which I think goes up in here, and that's so that it goes back in exactly the right spot again. When you're installing the subframe, that's not really too tough of a thing to manage if you can move the subframe around a little bit. First things first, you've got these bolts in the front, then you got these guys in the back. Probably loosen those. Now you see these subframe bolts here are being installed along with our ultra racing brace that we did a little bit of a test fit on. So we're probably just going to take that brace out, and then those bolts are going to come out with it. And then the ones that you might get hung up on if you don't know they're there are these guys. Taking these out is usually an easier way to go, but it looks like they've got a kind of a funky head on them, so probably going to just take that bad boy out. And then really, we should be able to separate the subframe from the car. All right, I got subframe bolts out everywhere, and I'm gonna raise the car up and see. This is gonna be a little interesting. Let's see. All right, see my control arm is moving here because Knuckle is kind of pulling on the control arm a little bit. So we'll just have to watch that as it comes up. And of course, if you're doing this at home, you're probably supporting the subframe with a jack of some kind and then lowering it down. Or you might have jacked up your car and then taken the supports out, lowered down the car so that the subframe is maybe on some wood, a pallet, or something like that. And then you could jack the car back up again and slowly the subframe would be left behind. That would be like the on-the-ground way of doing what I'm doing here. Lower the car down and then support the subframe while you lift like this. Okay. Really just want to make sure that these control arms are free. Yeah, it's really getting hung up here. Apologies for the odd motion here, but I'm wanting to make sure that you can see what's going on. What's going on here? You really got to watch out for stuff that might be getting tugged on. Looks like I forgot to unclip this harness here. All right, so now that harness is free, good. Anything else? Looks like the steering column is separating out the way it ought to be. And again, just not a whole lot we can do about these control arms. That one is free. This one is hung up, but it looks like it will come free easily enough. Do we see any wire harnesses or anything over here that's getting tugged on? No, I see nothing. All right, let's go a little further. All right, I think we just have this arm over here, wherein if we push that out of the way, oh yeah, just getting hung up on that nut. And my little plan backfires as I leave the nut on so I don't lose it. So catch on the body work there, boom. Wow, that thing is naked underneath. All right, now it's time to wheel this subframe out of the way and continue on to the next bit of instructions, which is gonna have to do with subframe out, resonator out, if you have a 2-liter, don't. Clutch cover remove, that's simple enough. Drive shafts, take those out. And it looks like we're gonna leave them hanging in the knuckles. We're gonna separate from the transmission and then remove the jack shaft, or the intermediate shaft as they call it, and then the transmission just magically comes out. Alrighty, the subframe is out of the car and off my stand, and it's on the ground there, and now, wow, what a view of the back of the engine we get. There's the starter. Don't ever change one of those without taking the subframe out, it looks like. We got a drive shaft here. Now this is another potential issue, right? We got sort of a concern here, because if I pop the axle out, is it going to swing farther forward? I think we already determined that I wasn't really holding this in the right place. So I'm going to just take a minute here and see if there's any way that I can maybe adjust how I'm holding things. Really what I'd like right now is a transmission jack. I don't really have one, or something that I could support the oil pan with on the bottom side. But I think what I might do is just install a strap or something like that around the starter and try to anchor it against the body somewhere, possibly tether it to this hole where the steering column goes through. I just think that having it so that it's back a little bit will be a good idea before I start taking anything else out here. Also, it looks like it might be a little bit of a challenge getting to some of the transmission bolts from down here. It didn't really say to take anything out above. I'm going to review the instructions and see. Yeah, I think one of the transmission bolts is like concealed behind the converter here, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm going to double check that now too. Looks like we got 1, 2, 3, probably 4 right here holding the transmission to the bell housing. Let's see what we got up above here. Is there one here? Yeah, there's one here. Yeah, there's probably one on the front side too. But then after that, strap it, axles, transmission bolts, and transmission should be able to come out after that. To get this jack shaft off, it's only 3 bolts. Pretty simple. I might not even separate this here. I might just undo those 3 and slide the thing out. All right, a little update on my progress here. I did end up putting a strap between that bracket and a little hole in the chassis right here. Not tons of tension on this. It's just kind of giving me a little peace of mind. So, and I did find that by putting a pry bar here against the axle, you know, if I pulled on this, I could, you know, rotate the engine back a little bit and tighten up the strap. So it's just giving me a little extra peace of mind. And I was able to pop out this axle just with a pry bar, you know, go in here and pop it out. It takes a little bit of force, but you could do it. And I was able to get the jack shaft and the axle on the right-hand side all out in one piece. Because I had the extra leverage of being on the ground with a lift like this, if you're working on the ground, for sure you're going to separate this apart. Now I think it's transmission bolts. So as I'm removing the transmission mounting bolts, I'm wondering if I missed a step, because somewhere in here it should have said to take some bolts out from the top. And here it does say upper transmission assembly mounting bolt removed. Here's the exploded view. We've got 4 along the back side, 2 in the front, and then 2 sort of like coming through the transmission on the other side. Here they are all laid out with the torque spec. It's 65 foot-pounds for all of these. The thing is that they don't tell you is that this one is shielded by the downpipe. It's there. This bad boy right here. Now you can see I've gotten it loose and I can unthread it, which is great, but it took some weird convoluted tool to get that loose. To be honest with you, this downpipe really needs to come out to easily get to this bolt. You can go ahead and try to do it without it. I was able to do it clearly. It only took me like 5 minutes to get it out, but the angle at which I had to do it, and that was a little difficult. You know, this one, easy, sure, tell me about that one after the fact. Oh, oops, I forgot to take a couple of those out, no big deal. But this one, it's like the cat's in the way. You really should have told us to take the converter out. I don't know, you may need to get the cat out to take that bolt out. Okay, we are getting there. I've got all of the transmission bolts out. The last one that I pulled out caused this little crack to form in the transmission. Yeah, it's definitely pretty loose. So what I'm gonna do now is I've got my cart back underneath. I'm gonna lower the engine assembly. The cart is sort of floating underneath the powertrain here. You know, so when I lower the car down, it's not gonna hit the body at all. I'm probably gonna put a piece of wood or something like that underneath the engine just to support it. And then I should be able to just pop the transmission right off. To make this work, I wonder if this guy will work well. Yeah, I just kind of want to support the engine on this bracket right here. So let's see, when I set this down, all right. So now the weight of the powertrain is on that little piece of wood here, and the transmission is pretty loose. Let me get a pry bar, see if we can pop her off of there. Oh, here she comes. All right, that's gonna come off. Let's give it a little love from the front side. What we really kind of want is to probably get another piece of wood, put it underneath the transmission, and then just weasel it off and then lift up the car and leave it behind. Well, the whole lift thing gave me a bit of a false sense of security because my little gantry rig shifted on me, let's just say. And so now the engine is sitting kind of cattywampus, and the whole works is together still, but it's just in a really weird situation. I put the car back down on the ground. I got a jack stand underneath the engine, and I'm gonna do traditional style with the jack underneath the transmission. And I'm gonna wiggle it a little bit, and when it comes off, the jack will take the weight of the transmission, and then I'll be able to raise the car up and get her out of here. This crane deal works great if you get it hooked up right, but this is not the right place to put it on. Hopefully after the transmission gets off, I'll be able to analyze a little more closely and find a better place for y'all to put the strap or chain or whatever you're gonna do. Well, I'm still trying to get the transmission out of here. I can't believe it's taken this long to get it off of the block. I've got it separated. I mean, you can see right there, the dowel pins are free. It should be falling out. Rearrange some things. I've got this hooked back in place here in more of a up and down fashion instead of a sideways fashion, which seems to have been a really good idea. There's a jack stand holding the engine up, and I'm really just trying to look for, you know, like hidden cameras or some other kind of pranky sort of thing that would prevent the transmission from coming away from the block, because it won't seem to go any farther than about a ½ an inch. I am going to probably give it another couple of cracks here, and if that doesn't work out, I will take a break and come back to it later. Of course, for you viewing at home, it will seem instantaneous when I get this thing off of here finally, but I assure you that it is not coming off like butter. Well, the transmission is out, and it's a really kind of a funny thing because it was really just this bolt way up here that I had taken out halfway. It appeared that the transmission was all and ready to just come flying out of the engine bay, but it was getting stuck with about a ½ an inch of space, and I couldn't really figure out why that was. And when I finally got underneath there and really looked, voila, there was the bolt that was holding everything still together. So now the trans is out, and the engine is levitating somewhat safely. We'll call it safe enough. And that is how you get the transmission out of the car. This video was brought to you by Heeltoe Automotive, where we're in your corner to get your Honda working just the way you need it to.